As you can see, I've got a picture of the male model that I used on the portrait drawing DVD. The reason why I chose this picture was primarily because he's got great facial features that really help me teach you this skull and the anatomy on his face. Now, are the angles all the same as this skull? Absolutely not. Look at how flat the back of his head is. Now, that is determined upon, actually when you're a baby. And if you were left in a crib for a long time, lying on your back of your skull is going to form and become like a little bit flatter. If you lay it on your stomach a little bit more, then you're going to have more of like a rounder back to your cranium, okay? So look at his eyebrow. It's way more sloped than, this skull is. This skull is like a little bit, or this, brow bone going up into the frontal bone is way more sloped than this skull. So, it's going to be very, very loose, but you're going to kind of, loosely interpretate the rules of anatomy when you're drawing somebody, because there's no two humans alike. Now, let's just kind of compare a little bit here. Now, look at the slope of the jaw. How that is really being matched. That was one of the prime reasons why I chose that, the mandible, okay? Look at the zygoma bone right over here, how it's starting to protrude. So we're turning under a little bit, and there's a little bit of shadow. Now, this skull has the light coming a little bit more from the left than this pose does. So that's the reason why this is a little bit more in shadow. And then there's all these muscles over here that are kind of pushing out the skin, so it's not as extreme. But you do start to see a little bit of that underplane, that front plane tone that is being matched over here. Look at how you're seeing a little bit of the light on that photo. That is the top plane right over here of this cheekbone. Look at all this light and how this thing wraps around the same thing that we've got going over here on that nasal bone. You can even see, it's hard, I don't know how this looks to you on video. It's probably small and it's probably really black, but I see a little subtle gradation right over here in your sinus kind of cavity, how we're just, kind of going up into that brow. There's like that little indent over there. Now, look at this sternomastoid muscle. What did I say before? How important that muscle is, and how important this mastoid process is behind the ear. Because right behind that ear is this muscle that comes down, and it's coming down right over here, and it attaches to your clavicles, fancier way of saying your collarbone, which is right over here. Now, the thing that you don't want to do when you're drawing a portrait and you're thinking about what's going on underneath the skin and you're drawing the skull is, number one, and this is the biggest mistake that I see over and over and over again, is a lot of artists do a black line over here for their jawbone, the mandible. And that thing totally separates the face from the neck. And I've already got it in, I've got a dark line, but that's one thing that you do not want to do. You do not want to do a dark line over there. So this mastoid process is huge, and then we've got our trapezius muscles that just kind of form the back of his neck. So if I was going to, draw him the same way that I started the skull, I would slope his brow a little bit more, and I would angle it in. I would just use the same principles, but I would just adjust. Now, all of this is being covered by his nose. So we've got his nasal bone, and then we've got this angle over here of the top of the bone, and then all of this is pretty much soft tissue and cartilage. So we can come on down now and get the tip of his nose, and right above, this is kind of like where his teeth are, and his lips are covering them. So I'm just going to very roughly guesstimate where I feel his bottom of his nose would be. And then we've got the bow out of his skin and his lips. This is all muscle. So there's a distance between his bone and the edge of his skin. And he has a slight grin because I think I told him a joke right before this picture. So then we're just going to kind of roll in. Now this is up for interpretation. I could pull this in a little bit more because his skull and his mandible and his maxilla could be a little bit more pronounced and a little bit out. The skull is just the plastic teaching skull is just a really generic thing. and he's got definite facial features, like his face is a little bit longer. So I would probably even like lengthen this. So lengthen his chin. So if I come on in now, look at the tip of his nose, and I'm really just paying attention to the edge of his skin, which, again, I don't like to do this that much because it's not the best way for me to teach, where I just kind of come on in. I'm just really looking at all of the angles, this angle, this angle, this angle, this angle, coming all the way down. And I don't like to do that too much because it's overly simplified way of drawing. It's just a habit that I've gotten into. That's pretty much the way that I draw. So now what I would do is I'd chop off some of the cranium. And the cranium is just that big round part of the skull that houses your brain. Okay, so I'm going to lift his hair up. So we're just going to raise this. And there are some parts of your face where, there's not much distance between the bone and the skin, and that is, classic example would be right here. You can really feel that nasal bone. You can really feel your mandible. You can really feel your cheekbone. It's when you start to, gain weight, or maybe you're just like a real normal human being and you have a lot of soft tissue around your bones. That's when you see less of your bones. So I guess the way that you want to think about this is you just really want to size up who you're drawing. Are they skinny? Are they tall? Do they have long legs? Do they have short legs? Are they bony? Or are they like a little bit more normal looking? Do they have some extra weight on their bones? And so that you make a decision, how are you physically going to draw them? So his mandible here is really angled. His whole head is angled. And so I'm going to kind of adjust my mandible. I got to watch my time here because I can talk about this for hours, this stuff. So we've got his auditory I think it's called the external auditory meatus, okay? And that is where your ear canal starts. So that's kind of like right in there. We don't see it because this part of his ear is covering that. So let's look at his cheekbone, because this will help me figure out where I'm going to exactly put his ear. So I look at this little light on his cheekbone. That is that. Okay, I look at that little underplane. That is that. So I'm going to see if I can follow this zygoma all the way to his ear. And I'm just looking for a highlight. This is a little bit lighter, this than that. Like I see some white over here, so that's telling me that that's more of like a top plane. So I'm going to make a call, and I'm going to put his ear right about here. And his ear is going to be pretty much even with his orbital bone. So it's the same identical thing that I teach in the portrait drawing DVD when I talk about the very simple two ovals that make up the skull for this placement stuff. Alright, so now I'm just very simply mapping out his ear and just putting that in, and I'm pretty much looking at the distance between his mandible and his sternomastoid muscle coming from his mastoid process right over here. And so that's fine. It's working. And so this again would be his trapezius muscle. Okay, so let's come around. And so what's another important thing that you would want to look for when you're drawing the skull? Well, right over here, this temporal line. And it's hard to see on him because it's in the light. It's really subtle. I'm going to pronounce it a little bit with my pencil. It's right there, that temporal line. And that is important. Why is it important? Because it shows you a plane shift from the front plane to the side plane of the head. And if we were going to think of this head now as surface planes, and we were trying to think about like the light and the dark, this would be an example of the head as a box. So that's why this is so important, because it separates the front from the side. Okay, and so let's just kind of keep going over here a little bit more. I think what would make a little bit more sense is if I actually drew the shape of his hair. Let's see if I can do that for you without ruining this drawing. So temporal bone right over here. So let's back up his hair. And this is coming right in. Here's his front of his ear. And his sideburn would come down and go over the zygoma cheekbone, and then we would kind of start it